If you could only see along when it's grubby, maybe you'd understand why I feel this way about white grubs, what I must do. If you could only see what skunks do to the turf, indeed you would treat when your turf is grubby. Well, it's almost season when the beetles fly, and we got some treatments to shorten their lives. See, white grub is what you do. You give a spray or you don't. When your lawn is grubby. Welcome to Around the Turf Scene. I'm Rusty Stacklewitz, and this is your periodical podcast about all things turf. Today, our guest is Nikki Hendrickson. She's going to talk to us about white grubs and white grub management, and let's get at it. With us today, we have Nikki Hendrickson from Advanced Turf Solutions. We're going to talk about white grubs. Nikki, if you could do a little introduction of yourself instead of me running through everything.
Well, I am an entomologist by trade, and when I say that, I have my bachelor's degree in entomology and horticultural production from Purdue University, and then I went on down to University of Kentucky and got my master's in entomology under Dan Potter. So anybody who's delved into the white grub world probably has heard of Dan Potter. He's one of the best turfgrass entomologists out there, and we did a lot of research on grubs.
So let's start off with some basics, and we're not going to get crazy into ID and things like that, but I think everybody who's listening to our podcast hopefully knows what a white grub is, so we won't start at that point to and go from there. But what are your control options for treating for white grubs?
So most of the time in our turfgrass world, when we talk about control options, we can go pre and then we can go post. And for the most part, we tend to go pre. And I'm guessing that's kind of what you're talking about here and what you want. So imidacloprid, the merits of the world, are still probably the most common preventative grub control that goes out. Imidacloprid's been on the scene for a while. We also have clothianidin. So in the products like Arena, you have clothianidin. And then the newer products are, I shouldn't say are, is Acelepryn. So Acelepryn's it's been out for a while, but as far as those kind of products go, that's the newer one. And Acelepryn has, I would say, it's got a little wider range of control than does imidacloprid or clothianidin. Imidacloprid is one, it's very water insoluble. When you put it down, wherever you water it down to, that is where that product is absolutely going to stay. So that watering in is pretty important. And you can go, closer to that time of hatch. Clothianidin, it's a little more water soluble than imidacloprid. So there's kind of the preventative. You can get into a little bit of post there, but the key to Acelepryn is it takes a little while for it to get activated in that soil and for you to get the best grub control out there. So when you're putting that product down, for grub control, do not put it down right at hatch. For the most part, with the imidacloprid, clothianidin, we're talking about putting that product down, in mid-June. The extension entomologist always here in central Indiana, July 4th, that is your time to put it down. And that is the key. And with Acelepryn, you're probably going to want to be at least in May, if not before, putting that product down.
Yeah, that's one of the nice pluses with the Acelepryn is you can have the luxury of putting it down early, but you do need to put it down early. If I'm not wrong, the efficacy drops as you get closer to the hatch date.
Yeah. You need to put Acelepryn down early versus imidacloprid. But that also allows you, we're not talking bill bugs here, but that also allows you to catch some of those other earlier season pests like bill bugs, at least in the home lawns. Because if you put imidacloprid down that early, you're going to be waning on that residual by the time that white grubs are. You'll catch them at the beginning, but that those later eggs that hatch, you'll be missing out on those.
Okay.
And getting control on those.
So, and I'll remind everybody that Nikki is in Indianapolis. So when she says dates, if you're further south of that, you want to go sooner. If you're further north, you can go a little bit later. But geographically speaking, in cool season turf, she's about in the center, so it's perfect for a good barometer there. There's a lot of talk about switching products from year to year, like we do with fungicides, so that you don't have resistance. Is that a concern? Is that something we should worry about with white grubs?
Most of the research still says that we don't get a lot of resistance to our traditional white grub chemicals, partly because our beetles are strong flyers. If we're talking Japanese beetles, they're very strong flyers, and we can get a new population to come into an area. But I can say that if somebody's really concerned, you know what? It will never hurt to switch up chemistries and prevent it. I did read, actually, probably about a month ago in one, I got to remember where it was that I read it at, but I was reading some articles online, and I thought it was one of the university guys who was looking into this a little bit more now, because some people have swore up and down that they're developing resistance, but I don't know that it's scientifically proven yet that we have and we're probably really talking imidacloprid here in those neonics, that we have resistance to neonicotinoids, but it can never hurt to change chemistries. And we remember, when we say change chemistries, I don't mean going from really imidacloprid to clothianidin. I mean going from imidacloprid or clothianidin to something like Acelepryn. And I hear Bayer is coming out with a new chemistry this year that could be thrown in that mix too.
Yeah, it's going to be similar timing to Acelepryn, I believe.
Yes. Okay. Yeah, I think it's related. I think it's going to be in that same class of family as Acelepryn.
Okay. So most of our turf managers and lawn care operators either pick a side and they treat every year, or they don't treat every year. And there's a few that scout and try and make a decision based upon beetle populations and things like that. How would you base your decision on if you're going to put out a product or not?
I would base my decision I wouldn't necessarily look at beetle populations, but I would probably kind of continually monitor damage from year to year and monitor my grub populations from year to year. Yes, you would think that in a year where we have more beetles and you're seeing beetles, you are probably more likely to have damage that year, and especially if you are on irrigated turf. So, those beetles emerge around here. We start emergence, like Japanese beetle emergence, coincides with linden bloom. So wherever you are, if you have lindens around you, start looking for those linden buds to swell, And that is when your adult Japanese beetles are going to emerge. Your mass Schaefers of the world, which there is a northern mass Schaefer, there's a southern mass Schaefer. The timing is about the same, but they can be a little earlier. And then I know when we get up into northern Indiana, there's some, like the European Schaefer is hitting up there. I think the Asiatic garden beetle is hitting up there. And then we do have those other, I'm going to call them the weird grubs. So our green June beetles, which aren't really truly feeding on the roots. And then we have our June beetles. So the bigger brown June beetles, and those can be 2 or 3 year grubs. But when it comes to scouting, for the most part, we're still talking about, Japanese beetles and Schaefers. The past few years, I have actually, whenever we have breakthrough and I go out and look at it, I always see mass Schaefers and not Japanese beetles. I don't see Japanese beetles a lot. So a lot of people think, oh, when I see a huge population of Japanese beetles, or I'm not seeing Japanese beetles, so I don't need to treat. And my guess is that for the most part, most of your population out there is Schaefers and not Japanese beetles. So we kind of need to be looking at other things versus just Japanese beetles.
Okay. What are your thoughts on pheromone traps? A lot of people use pheromone traps for scouting, and pheromone traps basically use scents related to sex for the insects, so they're drawn into those traps. What is that a good tactic in your mind?
Not really. So back when I was in Potter's lab, we used a lot of traps, and for the most part, when you buy those, bag of bugs, and they come with either the pheromone lures. So pheromone lures, you are primarily only collecting males. You're only collecting males, and then there are the floral lures, and the floral lures were pretty potent. We would put them out, and like on the research farm, there was this one spot where we would hang them in some hackberries. And if anybody knows, Japanese beetles, they'll feed on just about anything, but hackberry is not one of their favorite trees. And we actually got to the point where we had that tree almost 1/3 defoliated because so many were flying in from all over. They were just so attracted to it. When you use either the pheromone lures or the floral lures, you will bring them in from all over, and it will actually look like you have a lot more than you probably do if you're basing it off of that.
Okay.
So I say no.
Excellent. So we talked about preventative control with those 3 different products. If you miss that window, or you somehow have breakthrough, what are your choices for a curative control if you're getting some white grub damage?
Good question. The most popular one that's going out is still probably Dylox. Dylox is a product that it'll give you really quick knockdown, very short residual. Dylox in general, that efficacy as far as what percentage of population that you're going to control is really probably only a 70% population, but it tends to be enough to knock down that damage. I have seen it applied where you go back out and you struggle to find a live grub out there, but through the research, since I worked for Bayer for quite a few years and seeing a lot of that research, it really was only about a 70% effective product. Your other options, most people think of clothianidin and imidacloprid as being only preventative products. Back in the day, Bayer had research showing that, you could actually get 80% control putting imidacloprid out in mid-August. August to early September, you could actually get 80% control. it just takes a while. You're going to be out there for a week before you kind of get that population knocked down. If you have animals digging, that's not a good thing. You want immediate knockdown, and that's where the Dylox can really help. Then there's clothianidin, which will also you can use it curative, and it speed-wise, it's kind of in between imidacloprid and Dylox. So just kind of depending on when you're seeing that breakthrough and how fast, do you have animals digging? Because if I had animals digging out there, I'm using Dylox. Sevin is also an option. Sevin, carbaryl. I don't know that many people who truly use it, but it can be a spot application. Sevin on that label, you cannot broadcast spray Sevin, but you could go in and treat some hot spots to get a fairly quick knockdown too.
Okay. And then the other benefit, I think, of using products that are also preventative is if there are grubs deeper in the soil, when you put Dylox out, they could potentially still come up. And that's kind of where that 70% control comes from, I think.
Yep. Yeah, so. I look at that too. If I'm at the beginning of August and I'm like, oh craps, I already have grubs out here that are doing damage and I didn't get it down. Though, you can still get egg lay and egg hatch for the rest of that month. So I would rather have something with a little bit longer residual too. And that's really where I think, imidacloprid and clothianidin can shine in those areas. Like I would put imidacloprid down in a heartbeat if I'm at the beginning of August and I still have a whole month left of beetles flying around and laying eggs.
Right. Potential damage still coming.
Yeah.
Is there anything else on the white grub front that we should think about before we wrap that up?
Am I missing something?
I don't think so. I wanted to check. Make sure I wasn't missing something.
Yeah, I can't think of anything. Like every now and then you'll get a call where you've got some of those bigger grubs and products aren't working quite as well. And I think a lot of people with imidacloprid want to go towards that lower rate too. The lower rate on imidacloprid works really good on Japanese beetles, but you need to go a higher rate to get really good control of those Schaefers. And when you're talking about those 2 or 3 year grubs, you might have a third instar grub out there that's doing damage. If you've got, I always say they're the Phylophaga species. That's the genus Phylophaga. There's several of those June beetles out there. And if this is your first time applying and you've got those bigger grubs out there, you're going to need to go either at a higher rate, or that might be an area where, you might have to go Dylox on those, because technically if it's a 3rd year grub or a 2nd year grub, you're really doing a curative and not a preventative. So something to think about when you're looking at breakthrough. Look at your rates, look at the amount of water going down with those products. Most golf courses, if they're spraying their grub control, they're probably putting down quite a bit of water. I know some guys who will put it down with a wetting agent to require less watering in of those products. In the lawn care world, most of ours is going out on a granular. And really, if your lawn is irrigated, if you're only putting a little bit of water down and you're not getting enough water and then you have breakthrough, it's really because the product didn't get to where it needed to be.
Okay.
So things to consider. But for the most part, we haven't had a lot. I don't see a lot of breakthrough.
No, and I don't either at all, honestly. Yeah. And I said we weren't going to talk about it, but I think we need to go into some of the basics really quick that some of the grubs do have different life cycles. You've touched on it a couple times that some are 1 year grubs and some are 3 year grubs. And so there's a big difference there. If you're coming into an area that hasn't had preventative treatment, you may run into some of these grubs that have grown to the size where a regular treatment won't harm them.
Yeah. So, we all look at that, the white grub complex, so to speak. And they always start off, if you've ever looked at those graphics, the big green June beetle grubs, which, like I said, they're not really feeding on the grubs. They'll be in the soil. They'll come up at night. They'll actually feed on the leaves of the plant, those grass blades. They do that, and then they'll go back in the hole at night. So I don't think I've ever seen damage from green June beetles. I like the beetles. I had a swarm of them a couple years ago. It was like my first year with Bayer, so it was probably back in 2008. And I was sitting in my home office, and I just hear this thump, thump, thump on the side of my house. I'm like, what's going on? I look out, and there's just like hundreds upon hundreds of green June beetles flying around my tree. And I was so excited. I'm like out there with my net. I'm going to catch these things, putting them in a killing jar. 4-Hers all over had green June beetles that year in their collection because I had them. But I've never really seen them do a lot of damage. The bigger ones are those mass chafers. And I've only had calls on twice on the Phylophaga species. And those were really when, for some reason, the golf course, they were always on a golf course, never had them as an issue in a home lawn. But a couple areas on a couple golf courses twice where guys hadn't treated for a couple years. And then all of a sudden, because they haven't had issues, then all of a sudden they've got an issue. And the issue was the bigger, that 3rd year Phylophaga grub, and they had an issue getting control of. And it's not that the damage with them is never quite as widespread, but because that of the size of that grub, you'll see, a little, that one grub it's feeding on quite a few more roots and can cause, more damage. You don't need quite that count that you do with Japanese beetles. I also had 1 year, I think it was at Audubon Country Club down in Kentucky when John Ballard was there. He actually called. He's like, Nikki, I came out this morning. I've got all these dead grubs on top of my green. He's like, I don't even know what caused it. He's like, there was a spray. I think there might have been a spray the last week or something. But what I think they were green June beetle grubs or something that came out to feed and then got caught with a late frost or something. Or they basically got kind of too cold and died. It was really a weird situation, but they were bigger white grubs. Okay. I didn't actually see them.
You heard the story.
I wasn't down there. Yeah.
Thank you for listening to Around the Turf Scene, your periodical podcast about turfgrass management. Around the Turf Scene is a production of Xylem Marketing. I'm your host, Rusty Stacklitz. I hope to see you again soon.